Hello and welcome back to the next video in our Chapter 17 lecture. This video is going to be covering the details of the ear anatomy, and then I'll have two more videos, one for the physiology of equilibrium and one for the physiology of hearing. So that's kind of my goals to wrap up this chapter. So let's take a look at the ear. It is divided into three subcategories, if you will, structurally. We have the external ear, the middle ear, and the internal ear. So the external ear functions primarily for collecting sound. So our auricle, which acts like a big funnel, kind of funnels the sound waves into our external acoustic meatus, which was one of our bone markings on your temporal bone, bringing that to our tympanic membrane. So the tympanic membrane is the boundary between the external ear and the internal ear, middle ear, sorry. It is a flexible connective tissue window that vibrates in resonance with sound waves. So we'll see that detailed more in the physiology of hearing. In the middle ear, this is where we find the auditory ossicles. There's three bones, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, and their job is to amplify this sound wave that's coming in through the external ear, vibrating the tympanic membrane. The bones then vibrate, and then they act upon what's called the oval window, which sits right here. It's another little flexible membrane kind of at the beginning part of the internal ear. And then in the internal ear, let me back up real quick. One other structure that we have in the middle ear is this pathway called the auditory tube. Sometimes it's called the pharyngotympanic tube, or sometimes it's called the eustachian tube, but that opens up into your nasopharynx. Pharynx is like the back of your throat. So we do have a connection from our throat opening to our middle ear opening. If any of you know of children, or maybe you or your own children had tubes in their ears, if you've ever heard of that saying, it is usually these little tubes that are placed in here to keep that auditory tube open, which allows for drainage of mucus or fluid that could be built up in that middle ear, which is can cause ear infections. If you have stagnant fluid, then you don't have a proper drainage. All right, so that is our middle ear structure. So primarily the auditory ossicles and that pharyngotympanic tube. And then the inner ear is where all of the structures for hearing and equilibrium take place. There are two bony structures here. This guy, I'm outlining in green, this is called the vestibular complex, which is made up of the vestibule and the semicircular canals. And then we have the cochlea, which is a snail shell part here. And so the vestibular complex is where the sensation of equilibrium is picked up and sent to your brain. And the cochlea is where hearing happens. So this is equilibrium, this is hearing. Okay, and we're going to zoom in on those and take a closer look at the detail. But in the big picture, this is our anatomy of the ear. So we have external ear, middle ear, and internal ear, and it is in the internal ear where the physiology of the hearing and equilibrium take place. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit closer to the middle ear details, and we'll identify those auditory ossicles. So your malleus is the big one that is attached to the backside of your tympanic membrane. Then it articulates with the incus. Incus is the middle one, which then also articulates with the stapes, which then is connected to the oval window, which is this flexible membrane that's part of the cochlear physiology. And then also down here, we didn't see it in the last picture, but in this more detailed picture, we can see the structure here called the round window, which is another flexible part to the cochlea. And all of that will make sense when we get into that structure a little bit in more detail. So we do have in this in this picture, we can see a couple accessory structures. We can see some ligaments that are helping to stabilize and hold those bones in place. And we can also see some muscles. The tensor tympani and the stapedius muscle, they help to prevent damage to your more delicate inner ear structures. So if you are anticipating a loud sound like fireworks or a gunshot or loud music, what you can do is these muscles will contract and tense up, and it prevents that tympanic membrane. When the loud sound wave comes in here, it's going to keep those bones from vibrating too much to cause damage to the cochlea, which is the hearing part of your inner ear. So those muscles are more protective in their function, in that they keep you from getting hearing loss and hearing damage, which is kind of nice. And then here's that opening of the auditory tube down there. All right, so those are the details of the middle ear. And then if we take a look now at the inner ear, so I divided this in half, right? So on the left, this is your vestibular complex. That's going to be all the structures associated with equilibrium. And on the right, this is the cochlea, which is dealing with your hearing. So that's kind of, keep that in mind. I'm saying it a lot because it's important to know the difference between those two things. But both the vestibular complex and the cochlea structurally have some commonalities, some similarities. And you'll notice the way that this is diagrammed is we kind of have a tan pattern of all of the loops and swirls of these two structures. This is actual bone. It's called a bony labyrinth. Okay, so the bony labyrinth is this tan, kind of the darker tan. It's all of this bony part here. Okay, the bony labyrinth. Inside of the bony labyrinth, you have hollow spaces, okay? And the first hollow space is called perilymph. So that's going to be all of the space that's in between the tan bony labyrinth and the blue membranous labyrinth. And this is a fluid called perilymph in that space. And then we have the membranous labyrinth. So imagine this would be like a membrane-bound tube. So that's all the blue stuff. Okay. And inside the membranous labyrinth, we have endolymph. Right? So we have the bony labyrinth is the giving you the shape, like the structure, the rigid shape. Inside that, we have the membranous labyrinth, which is basically the same shape, but bounded by a membrane. And in the space between the membrane and the bone is perilymph, and then the space enclosed by the membrane is endolymph. Okay, so here we have the kind of the color code up here in the corner. The tan is the bony labyrinth, the blue is the membranous labyrinth, and then the kind of the hollow looking space in between those two things would be filled with perilymph, and endolymph is inside. All right, so that is common between the cochlea and the vestibular complex. So now we can take a look at the structures that are found, or we'll break down the vestibular complex. So this blob here that we kind of saw in that last picture is called the vestibule, the big swollen part like this right here, kind of circling around that. So that's the vestibule. And then all of these little loopy loops that are coming off of it are called the semicircular canals or semicircular ducts. Okay. The vestibule is divided into a couple regions. Okay. So we have the, let's see. Let me find it. So the saccule is the smaller of the two, and the utricle is a little bit larger. Okay, so saccule is kind of closer to the cochlea, if you want to landmark it that way, and then the utricle is a little bit closer to the semicircular canals. And then at the base of the semicircular canals, we have these kind of swollen areas, and these are called ampulla. Okay, so these guys right here are the ampulla. Okay, so structurally, we have the vestibule, which is made up of this utricle and the saccule. We have the semicircular canals, and at their base, we have the ampulla. So those are all important anatomical terms that you need to know. You do not need to know the directionalities of each of those semicircular canals, just you can collectively call them semicircular canals. Okay. So then within these structures, and we're going to get to this more in detail for the physiology, but for the anatomy part, we need to know where they're found. So we have these receptors here are called macula. So the macula are these little plate-like structures, and they are found one in the utricle and one in the saccule. And then the other receptor is called a crista. Now they have different names for these, and I haven't updated my notes. They might have. Oh, ampullary crests. So they're not really called crista ampullaris anymore. They're called an ampullary crest, but I'll probably have that updated on the physiology video. So when we do talk about equilibrium, we're going to be talking about the macula, the crista, within the vestibule, and the semicircular canals and the movement of the fluid through these spaces. So here's a closer view of the semicircular ducts and the vestibule. So again, here is our saccule, here's the utricle, here's our macula, here's our ampulla, and then here's our, they don't label them, but these are ampullary crests or crista ampullaris. I'll just call them crista because that's kind of the name that I learned, but ampullary crests, I think, is what your book is calling them. And then again, we can see a closer view of the bony labyrinth and the membranous labyrinth. And the fluid in here is going to be perilymph, and the fluid in here is going to be the endolymph. Okay, so start getting comfortable with that. I will mention here, since it's kind of a close-up of this semicircular, kind of this area, there's a structure called the endolymphatic sac, and this is kind of like the recycling center for the endolymph. So new endolymph comes in and old endolymph gets recycled. So it's like the recycling center for the fluid. We can also see all of those sensory receptors, the macula and the crista, are being monitored by branches of the vestibular nerve. If you remember, cranial nerve number 8 is our vestibular cochlear nerve. It is a combo nerve. The vestibular part of it is carrying the equilibrium sensations. The cochlear part of it is going to be carrying the hearing sensations. So we can see each one of those, each one of the crista, the macula, the 2 macula, and the 3 crista are all sending signals via the cranial nerve 8, the vestibular branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve. Okay, so that wraps up the anatomy piece of our ear. We did the outer ear, the middle ear, and a couple closer views of the inner ear. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the cochlear structure in the hearing video, so that will be coming up a little bit later. So I will see you next time. Bye.